10 o'clock. We got people filing in. Jim, welcome everybody to our bi-weekly webinar here that I host with Jim Brown. We're excited to have you all in here. As we were just discussing, as we were starting here a few minutes ago, we got some big shifts in the industry. I've been doing this for over 20 years as an active real estate agent in the trenches with you all. And it's so awesome that we have a great real estate attorney here, that's going to be sharing his expertise, especially the new listing agreement obviously just came out. We're going to be going over that. But yeah, we host this to actually help us agents improve and make our industry better. This is one of my favorite parts of every other week that we do, and I'm excited here to host this with Jim, and you share your knowledge for everybody here on the call. It's a lot of changes. It can be scary. Like I said, I've had a lot of my friends, fellow agent friends, call me and discuss, and I said, hey, tune into the webinar we're going to be going over today. So if people that don't know me, I'm a real estate agent, like I said, for over 20 years. I'm also the founder of RealTrade, which is an online marketplace and social media platform for real estate. We have now over 2,500 agents from over 300 brokerages, Jim, on RealTrade. Cool thing is we have thousands of buyers and sellers, and we have awesome service providers like Jim, lenders, inspectors, appraisers that you can get in contact with. Cool thing is on RealTrade, you get free leads. So make a profile, it's free, and you can get leads off your listing directly, or they can discover you on the social feed. So
Ryan, most importantly, though, in light of what we're discussing today, I've heard a Florida realtor attorney. I don't want to mispronounce her name. What is it, Juanita? She said that the IDX feed can now feed the Florida rule is that the IDX feed can be used to feed non-MLS listing displays that advertise buyers concessions. So that would include RealTrade. Are you guys, I don't mean to put you on the spot or do anything ad hoc, but are you guys going to lean into that, take advantage?
Yeah, we're still trying to get clarity on that, Jim. Obviously we don't want to,
No, that's not in print anywhere. It's just
yeah.
something I heard on two different
Yeah.
spots from the.
We'll find out. I mean, our big thing is to make it more efficient for agents, make them easy connect with other agents, sell properties quicker and get leads. So, if this can help agents be more efficient, obviously we're all,
Yeah,
so.
huge opportunity. All right, I
Yeah.
want to start by saying that you guys, the goal of this podcast, the goal of this discussion is for you to hear stuff you won't hear anyplace else, right? I don't have to conform to anybody's rules and disclosures, and I try to scrape everything I can scrape. Housing Wire, Inman, all the local information I can scrape and consolidate it so that you guys can digest it as easily and put it into practice. And also discuss some, I guess I would say, edgy topics that you won't hear anyplace else because I don't have to conform to other corporate constraints or legal constraints. If you guys can turn on your cameras, I love to see your responses. It makes it easier for me to move through the material quicker. There are no dumb questions. Anything you want to ask, put it in the chat. Ryan will do his best. I'll do my best to scrape it, and we can go over that stuff. I want to keep it to 45 minutes if we can. We'll have a question and answer at the end. I'm happy to hang out as long as you guys want, and you can text me 24/7. You can go to newpathtitle.com. You can click on 24/7 Realtor support, and you can text me and we can come up with topics for the next show or go over topics covered in this show. And that's it. You want to
I have
say
to say
anything,
that's
Ryan?
one of the best things working with Jim. The guy answers his text literally 24/7. It is pretty awesome, Jim, that you do that for the community.
I'm really happy and it's paying off, right? It's a lot of work, but I talked to a lot of my buddies in the title industry and they're telling me that they're not holding their own and we're holding our own in a tough economy. So it's a gamble and it's a commitment, right? But I learned from you guys every time you text me with something. I learned yesterday. G and I were talking yesterday morning, and I talk to agents all the time, and she came up with ideas on this stuff, perspectives I never thought of. Had we not had that open dialogue, I wouldn't have learned that. It just makes me better when you guys have issues and we're doing closings, we can get to the issue quicker, right? How do people spend a lot of time and energy in this business? They don't know when there's an issue, and when they know there's an issue, they don't know where to find the answer. If you guys can issue spot quickly and you know where to get the answer, that's great. If you don't know where to get the answer and you know there's an issue, text me and we'll figure out what the answer is. That's how we move through these things gracefully. All right, without further ado, where did that phrase even come from? Without further ado. All right, let's see.
Yeah, we can see your screen, Jim.
You can see my screen. I got the outline on the left. I've got my new Florida listing agreement on the right. Can you see everything? Can you read everything, Ryan?
Yeah, I can see it, Jim. It looks good.
All right. So it's August 12th, 2024. The NAR settlement rule changes go into effect from a practice perspective this Saturday, the 17th. As much as I've read, and as much as I can listen to, including this morning on some podcasts that were just put up to YouTube this morning while I was working out, I've digested as much as I could. And here's a summary of all I've taken in. I've been in the real estate industry 40 years. I've been in private practice 20. We've survived the MLS move from books and paper to the web. Everybody thought that was the death of the business. If anybody was around, I don't remember what the date was. I remember my girlfriend was an agent in an office that had paper and we had floor time, and everybody said, you go to the web, the agent is a thing of the past. How many years ago, how many people practicing today don't even remember when there was paper and we only know books? So if you were practicing when there were books and we were going to the web, everybody thought it was the end. And if you've only practiced on the web, you couldn't imagine what there were ever books. This is just one of those inflection points. We had the 2009 recession. Everybody thought real estate agents were over after the 2009 recession, and we started seeing the emergence of platforms. That didn't put an end to our practice. We've learned since that that buyers and sellers want people more than they want platforms. Clearly, the data supports that. Chinese drywall.
Remember that?
Everybody thought, oh, I forgot an even bigger. I see Gia shaking her head again. What about the change when we added inspections and an automatic out to the contract? When we added the clause to the contracts that allowed agents to bail if they offered buyers the option to bail with no penalties, everybody thought that real estate transactions were a thing of the past, agents were a thing of the past, property will never sell. Here's the reality. Just because we change rules doesn't mean buyers and sellers don't want homes, right? And I can remember when I first heard of the business, before I was in the business, Carter was the president, oh my God, and interest rates were 14 and I believe 16%. And my old man bought a house. I said, Dad, what's 16%? My old man said, you borrow $100, you have to pay the bank $16 a year just for the right to use the money. I was like, what, are you kidding me? No one will ever borrow money. And they borrowed money. Chinese drywall, we got through that. And don't forget, you guys, 17 states already have mandatory buyer agreements in place. They've had it for years. There's no difference to the way they do the business, except for the fact you have to have agency agreements signed. This is not an end of the road. This is just a change in the road. All right, when meeting with buyers or sellers, don't go into lengthy explanations on the new rules. I can't tell you how many agents are texting me, how do I explain the new rules? Here's the answer, you don't. You ask your buyer, you ask your seller, what do you know? And then you augment what they tell you with one simple statement. Tell them as your agent, you have a couple of jobs. My main job is to find or sell your home. Another job is to stay on top of the rules, which we have 2 new ones that we have to follow. Full stop, full period. Don't go into a lengthy discussion. The first rule is we can't offer buyers compensation on the MLS as we've done for a million years. The second rule is agents working with buyers now have to get written buyer agreements. Again, full stop. There's no change, no matter how many times you hear it or your buyers and sellers hear it, and they're all hearing it, there's no change to the commission structures. In 2019, the Department of Justice said they could be as little as $1, but that was a ruling. I mean, they've been negotiable and they've been optional and they've been fully negotiated ever since 2019, what was it, 1890, The MLS was started, the early versions were started when the barber, the bartender, and the doctors used to meet up because they saw everybody in the town. They'd meet up, whatever the frequency was, and they'd talk about the people who sat in their chair or sat at their bar and wanted to sell stuff, and they had fully negotiable commissions back then. It's never changed. Sellers have always signed listing agreements, and now buyers will sign listing agreements. Then now buyers will sign buyer's agency agreements. It's as easy as that. Normalize it. You're not whitewashing it, you're normalizing it, and that's exactly what the situation is. Sellers have always signed listing agreements. The only new rule is now buyers have to sign written buyer agreements. Okay, so this is a fun one. As an aside, don't try to do, I've listened to a million podcasts, there's a ton of bad information out there. Don't try to do clever stuff that agents are trying to do, alluding to buyer's comp. So there was a whole discussion, and I saw a big illustration of the clever things agents said they were going to start doing in their listings to allude to buyer's comp. One agent was advertising she would put the number of pillows on the couch that would represent buyer's comp. Another agent said she was going to put cookies on the counter and allude to buyer's comp. So if you saw 3 cookies on the counter, they were paying three points to the buyer side. Another agent said they were going to put bananas on the kitchen table. They were going to arrange it in some decorative way, and there was going to be 3 bananas meant 3 points to the buyer side. You cannot link your Facebook page if there are buyer's comp offers in your Facebook page. That is a hard stop, can't do it. You cannot link to your broker's listing page if there are buyer's comp offers there. So if your broker's listing page, list of all your properties, has offers of buyer's comp in that site, you can't have a link in your MLS to that site. Does anybody have any questions about that? I don't want to belabor the point. There's a million.
I refilled my thing from the app.
Say that again, Jason? Nope. All right. You can have offers of buyer's comp in yard signs, flyers on the counter of your open house. And according to the Florida Realtors latest education video that came out 3 days ago, buyer's comp offers on your website, even if your site is fed from the IDX. That's what Ryan and I were talking about a little earlier. I put a link to the video right here. You can watch the video if you want. I didn't put a timestamp in there, but I'll go back and put a timestamp in there so that you can pick it up. It's this woman, Patty Ketchum. She is not the Florida Realtors attorney, but this is a Florida Realtors authorized video. All right, I don't want to beat up the buyer's side practice form too much today or get too deep into it, but I do want to go over a couple of clever things I heard talking about buyer's agency agreements. We all know if a buyer shows up at your open house, no buyer's agreement is necessary. You're working for the seller. That's in a FAQ and an RFAQ. I still get a ton of texts about that. But here's the interesting practice tip I heard. I hate the term hack, but here's an interesting practice hack I heard. When the buyer shows up, always ask them for the name of their agent. Buyer shows up, as a matter of course, you just say, what's the name of your agent? We all know in the back of our mind, buyers are going to show up with or without agents having engaged, but then they show up, you automatically say, what's the name of your agent? If they say they don't have one, you could possibly double dip on the sale, show them other properties, get a showing agreement signed. You don't have to get the full blown, let's see, apply these permissions. What's going on, Ryan? Allow recording. So you don't have to get, I just got a message. I'm sorry, you guys. You don't have to get a showing, you don't have to get the full-blown agreement signed. Don't put your buyer on their heels with the giant mound of paper. Just get the showing agreement signed. If they want to see other properties, it's an easy in to see other properties. That little thing, that little discussion, oh, hi, welcome to the open house, and you slip in early, can you tell me the name of your buyer's agent? That starts the conversation in a comfortable way. If they say they have an agent, tell them all offers must go through that agent. Don't work for free. You don't have, or don't have a conflict. But there's a reoccurring theme here, and we'll go into it in a little bit more deeply. And that is, in other states that have had buyer's agency agreements for a long time, they've learned little tools to get around it. This is another one to help with buyer's representation agreements. If you ask your buyer, so you're signing your buyer's agency agreement, if you ask your buyer if they only want to see properties offering sellers concessions to buyer, write this in the additional terms section. Everybody's familiar where the additional terms section is. We don't have to go into it, but if you write that in, and you can even have concessions over a certain percentage or be more specific. But here's the point of what I'm trying to make. If you ask your buyer that they only want to see properties that are offering buyers concession, if you find a property that fits their criteria that's not paying buyer concession, tell the listing agent your client only wants to see buyer properties offering buyer concessions. You've not done anything wrong. You've done everything right. But here's the magic. Here's the gold. If the seller insists they won't pay, reveal the property to your buyer and gracefully tell them they have to go it alone on this one property. Agents in states where buyers' agreements have been the rule for years report if the agent has done a good job for the client in prior transactions or in this relationship, many buyers will agree to pay a buyer's agent commission on that home. If you guys have heard this from somebody else, I want to see a show of hands. I have listened to so many discussions on this topic, but it just seems to me like you create this great relationship, you find this one home, you have the conversation with the listing agent because your buyer has authorized you to have this. Your buyer has authorized you to have this conversation and say, my buyer only wants to see properties that are offering buyer concessions. Are you offering a buyer concession? If they double down and they say no, now you go back to your buyer, you say they're not offering, I'm happy to help you. I can't work for free. I hear this over and over from the Florida realtors, which I love. You don't have to agree to work for free. And many times other agents in other states are reporting that the buyers are saying, well, we'll be happy to pay you something, or we'd be willing to pay you something. Nobody's ever happy to pay. We'd be willing to pay because you've been working so hard for us. Gia, what do you got?
Let's go back to B for a second. Seller insists they won't pay, reveal the property to the buyer, and gracefully tell them they have to go it alone on the property.
Gia always gets me on these things.
Let's say you're the listing agent. And the buyer's agent basically says, here's my client because you're not paying. They can't pay me. They're going to go it alone. How's the listing agent going to get paid? So basically what I hear reading this is the listing agent's going to be doing double duty for only getting paid on one side of a transaction rather than getting paid for both sides of a transaction. How does that work?
This is like our conversation we had yesterday. We have to drill down on we have to explore together and come up with rules. When your seller says we're absolutely not paying buyer's comp, how do you get paid and not work for free?
Sorry.
Because you may have sellers that say we're absolutely not paying buyer's comp, and agent, you got to figure it out.
Right, because the buyer's not going to write the contract up on a napkin and say, I'm buying the property.
How does the buyer get an offer in front of that seller?
Correct.
I agree. I don't know what the answer is, but I agree. If you guys have suggestions, I'd love to come up with some rules that we can all implement together.
I mean, I think it's the listing agents, if he's going to be, hard with the seller and just do it at the 3%, and then he goes, well, if we get a direct buyer, then the seller's going to go, well, then you're just going to do the deal at 3%. You know what I mean? I mean, that's to me.
I would also say that as a listing agent, I don't want to work for free. And this isn't meant to be a self-serving plug, but I would also say to the buyer, hey, you got to go get an attorney.
Hey, Jim, I thought I think there's maybe a solution, a little bit of a solution, and that, can you hear me?
Yep,
Yep.
loud and clear.
Okay. When you actually put the contract together, the contract for sale, you can have in your additional notes something about additional, you can't call it compensation, but you can, I don't know what you can call it, but
You can call it
consideration.
concessions.
Concession, yeah, or consideration that the price of the house is $1 million, and 10,000 additional concession to the seller, for, you know, whatever you want to call it. I mean, without calling it a commission.
No, you
I
can, you
was
can
told-
call it officially under the Association of Realtors, Florida's Focused Realtors. They want to hear the word concession.
Okay, so
And
you can call it a
here's the one
concession, and that's
thing-
allowed, I thought, under this,
It
under
is
this.
allowed, but here's the one thing, the two rules against that. You can't offer concessions that are strictly stipulated to be used for buyer's agency fees. You can't offer a concession if the parameter constraint on the concession is they're only going to be used to pay a buyer's agent. We'll go over that again when we talk about 3C and the new listing agreement, but that's a clear bright line rule. And now I forgot the other rule, but it'll come back to me.
But
Sorry
Jim,
about that.
Jim, that's making an assumption that the seller will give any kind of a concession. If the seller's
Correct.
not willing to give any kind of a concession, and that listing agent is having to do the work for the buyer and the seller, only getting the seller side commission, not
remember
the
the
buy
new
side
rule.
commission, how does that get resolved?
I hate to say it out loud, but I think, not that I hate to say it out loud, I just hate the answer, but I think that what Ryan said may become prevalent. I think sellers may say, figure it out. I'm paying what I'm paying, figure it out.
Mhm.
I don't like it, but I think that's what they might say. I know some sellers that will say that because I've already talked to people
Well,
that are.
and we'll dig into this when we get in the listing agreements, but you know, if you're signing the listing agreement as a transaction broker, right? You know, I mean, you're kind of can represent both sides there, you know, and it's the seller's going to go, you're going to represent both sides for 3%.
The only other way around it is you increase the purchase price by the amount that the concession needs to be. The only problem is it's got to appraise.
Right.
I just remembered, I agree. I just remembered the second rule. So the first rule is you cannot connect buyer concessions in any way, shape, or form in writing or verbally to buyer's agency fees. If the seller's offering concessions to buyer, you can't connect it to buyer's compensation to the agent. The second thing you can't rely on is privity. When I talk about privity, when we talk about privity is when two people have a contractual relationship.
Right.
The privity exists with the two people who sign the agreement. So if a buyer and a seller sign an agreement, and to Lindy's point, if they put in the contract that the seller's paying X or the buyer's paying Y, the agent is not in privity with the buyer and the seller, and they cannot rely on that representation as a guarantee of payment. I wanna say that one more time because I can't tell you how many times in the course of a year I get a text from an agent and they say they wrote this on the contract and they paid this at closing. Any addendum between a buyer and a seller changes a contract with or without the listing or the buyer's agency agreement. And if they've represented something in a contract, unless the agent is signing the contract and they're a party to the contract, that's between the buyer and the seller. And they can change that stuff anytime they want at the closing table at the last second. Yes, I've seen it happen that way. So agents have to always remember the concept of privity, the legal theory of privity. And that is, if you didn't sign the agreement, you don't have a right to its enforcement. Chris, did you have your hand up?
I did, but I mean, I think we've kind of run past the topic, covered a lot in between. But I would just say this, like I came from the Maryland, DC region where buyer agency was very common, you know, just we're going to be fine. But as far as if a seller is not going to pay a buyer agent, It would be no different than a seller not paying closing costs for a buyer who needs closing costs. You just might not end up buying it. You try to negotiate it. If it doesn't work, they just may not buy it. And I think we all have to realize a negotiation can sometimes end where both parties don't agree and you move on to another property.
And I've heard from agents in other states, I mentioned it a little bit earlier, several times, that if you've done a good job for your client, you're representing a buyer and the seller's absolutely not willing to pay, many times the buyer steps up and says, well, we're going to pay you. Industry first, our closing cost calculator will soon have built-in functionality for buyer concessions and buyer agent fees on both buyer and seller sheets. This will make much easier for agents to explain the effect of these fees on seller nets and buyer closing costs. I can't tell you how many times I've tried to explain something to somebody and a simple picture saves so much time. So while you're sitting at the listing appointment, while you're sitting at the buyer's agency table, and you're getting those agreements signed, if you can use these tools, it's just going to make your life so much easier because you're not speaking in hypotheticals. They'll see the effect on the bottom line, whether on the buy side or the sell side. I get a 1,000 texts, I get many texts over this. I got one today. If the listing agent has a pending listing on August 17th, that should be on. With no contract, what do you do? Lots of agents have texted me. So if you use the March 2024 listing agreement or newer, send your client the mandatory disclosure. You can look at NAR FAQ number 52. It spells that out. It does not have to be signed. All you have to do is keep the email. They've expressed this repeatedly in the Florida Association of Realtors education videos. I haven't seen it in writing anywhere yet, but we called the hotline and they explained it to us, and it is now in the videos. Without this, no settlement protection is available to the agent. There will be testers. I said this before, you guys. I'll say it again. The attorneys who did PI work have contacted me and they've said, we want to start doing real estate work. I thought they meant closing work. No, they mean chasing realtor issues to get into the broker's E&O policies. I'm just going to leave it at that. After tort reform, there's a lot more attorneys in Florida looking for this work, and they will have private testers in our workplace testing people to make sure they're doing their job properly. If you're using the form older than March 2020, if you're using the listing agreement that's older than March 2024, re-sign your listing on the July 2024 form. Why? The July 2024 form has this language all over it that says sellers' commissions are not dictated by law. Where is it? They're negotiable. Where is it, you guys? Here it is. Number 10 at the very top, compensation of buyer's broker. Broker commissions are not set by law and are fully negotiable. You just have to send your agent that email. I haven't seen it in writing, but I've heard it discussed many times. I'm sure it exists in writing somewhere. I haven't been able to locate it. If anybody can, send me a text. I'd love to see it and make it part of the outline. You just have to give that disclosure to your client if you're using the form that's newer than March 2024. If you're using the older form, get a re-sign of the newer agreement. Does that make sense?
Oh.
All right. The new listing agreement form, the moment we've all been waiting for. It's 10:30. I'm going to try to keep this tight. The first sections of the new listing agreement form, there are no major deviations.
So this is the exclusive right to sell.
Transaction broker form.
See, where's it say transaction broker? Because I just wanted to see on that form. Is that down below like it was on the buyer's agency agreements?
Broker's obligations, multiple listing service. Authority, seller obligations, compensation, notice to seller granted.
Yeah, right there, number 11. So that's where that's actually where it spells it out. Broker will.
Yep, right there at number 11. Good point, Ryan. So I always used it, I always referenced it when the buyer's agency forms came out, I struggled to figure out which form to use. And it's paragraph 12 of the buyer's agency agreement forms. It's going to have one sentence in there that says, this is the transactions form. In the listing form, they've done the same thing. Paragraph 11, this time it says, broker will act as a transaction broker. That's the form everybody that I've heard from is using.
Okay.
I don't, as I was running today, listening to another podcast, I don't know why all these forms are available. Everybody says the same thing. They're only using this form.
Go to the top.
The first section of this form, can everybody see it well?
Yep.
Is fundamentally unchanged. There are some minor differences in there. You will see in paragraph 3, they've added a seller's expense paragraph here, provision here, with a dollar value, not a percentage. We're going to come back to that in a minute. I don't want to make this paragraph the focus of the conversation yet, but I want to, after we talk about the other paragraphs, explain why this has been such a big issue for many agents. You've got the broker obligations, you've got the multiple listing service. This rule is under contention right now. Ryan mentioned another lawsuit pending in, what was it, Michigan?
Michigan, yeah.
There's another
NAR is getting sued, yeah.
There are
Well,
other
they're saying they
lawsuits.
shouldn't make it mandatory for the agents to join NAR to get onto the MLS. So
And
that's
there are other lawsuits that are regarding the ability to maintain pocket listings and the duty to post stuff and make it go live within a certain time frame of when you start marketing it.
wow. So they're still making it mandatory. You have to put it on the MLS, even if you're offering no buyer's agent commission within 1 day. Wow.
I don't like the rule. I just want everybody to be aware it's there, and it's also under challenge.
Okay.
Broker authority, couple of changes here, nothing significant. Seller obligations, again, same outcome. Now here's where it changes. 8 through 10. These are the changes that are significant, and we have to think about how to strategize. And if I was a listing agent sitting at the table with a seller, I would go over that first section 3, A and B. I wouldn't explain C yet. I would talk about the terms of the sale, 3A and B, and then I would skip down to 8 and get the meat of the stuff done, 8, 9, and 10, and then go back and fill in the blanks with your client on the other section. So what does 8 say? Seller will compensate broker specified below if a buyer procured who is ready, willing, and able to purchase the property. They made this stuff a lot shorter, a lot more concise. I think they did a pretty good job on this section. Here you're going to put in the commission paid to the selling agent, and we're going to go over how that'll be split up. Here you're going to put in the consideration paid to the agent if an option is signed, and here you're going to pay the fees paid to the agent if a lease is signed. Oh, one big thing I failed to mention at the beginning of the conversation. The NAR settlement constraints, who do they apply to? They apply to agents that are not selling vacant land, that are not doing commercial properties, that are not leasing, and that are doing more than 4 families. More than 4, the constraint, the NAR settlement rules only apply to agents doing 1 to 4 family residential. Doesn't apply to vacant land. I've already received that call several times. Doesn't apply to commercial, doesn't apply to leasing, and only applies to 1 to 4 family unit residential properties. So here you have the compensation that the seller will pay the broker if a lease is entered into. They go over a much briefer statement on when commissions are due. I like it. Here you have a paragraph they've added. Notice to seller regarding buyer's broker. This is an important paragraph. It sets out how the fees are going to be broken up. I think they did it a little redundantly, but anyways. The buyer's broker, even if compensated by seller, see how this is capital lowercase b. This is an unspecified buyer's broker. It's somebody we don't identify. In the contract, this contract, in the listing agreement contract, the broker is the selling agent's broker. It's all going to be capital B. So whenever you see capital B, we're talking about the broker that the seller is hiring. When we see lowercase b, buyer's broker, it's going to be whoever else joins in the transaction. Seller is advised and is aware that seller may, but is not required to compensate a buyer's broker upon closing. Seller may choose to enter into a separate written agreement to pay buyer's broker, or may approve broker to pay buyer's broker in accordance with paragraph 10. Seller also understands buyer's broker may include this broker. Don't get confused that this is capital because that's just the first word in the sentence. If broker also works with buyer in this transaction, we can all think of 1,000 scenarios where that applies. If this occurs during the duration of the listing, broker will be entitled to the compensation in paragraph 8 for services performed for seller, as well as the buyer's broker compensation in paragraph 10A for services performed for the buyer. The seller should therefore take this into consideration when negotiating compensation, and broker may receive separate compensation from buyer for services rendered to buyer or by broker. I don't want to go into that paragraph because what's that? Say it
No,
again.
it's very important. I mean, this is, it pretty much is laying this out, the scenario that we were discussing earlier, right?
So if
This is where you're really going to have the heart-to-heart with the seller, because if you want to get paid a double dip, you know what I mean? You're going to be having to offer to the buyer's broker.
So I thought about that a lot. And again, Gia and I were batting this around yesterday, and something came to mind that she brought up, and I drilled down on it a little bit further, and I'll share it with you in a minute. So one of the brokers I met with recently, we came up with this little rule, and I like the rule. You put the number here that you'd be willing to double dip with if the buyer is unrepresented. So let's just say it's a 6. And then you come down here and you select A. If the buyer doesn't have an agent and you're doing work for the buyer, this is a transaction broker form. Now you can double dip. If you're the election that the seller is going to want, if it's an educated seller, is going to be B. And up here, you would put the fee the compensation portion that the selling agent would be willing to work for. So under the first scenario, you put a 6 here, and you put these are just examples. I'm not supposed to give you guys any commissions. When you listen to the videos, they talk about 500 bananas and 500 fruits and these things because they're not supposed to say the word commission. I'm willing to go out on that limb. So if you put 6 in A, 8A, you select A. If you put 3 in 8A, which is what the sellers are going to want, then you're going to select B. But and what Ryan was alluding to earlier, and that just says that the seller authorizes broker compensation to buyer's broker from seller. So the difference between these is the seller's agent is paying the buyer's agent. And if there is no buyer's agent, the seller's agent is keeping the 6. Let's just say if you put the 6 above. In this election, the seller's agent is keeping the 3 from 8A, and the seller themselves is going to offer a 3, let's just say, for example, to the buying agent directly from the seller. So in 8A and in 10A,
coming from the broker. Yep.
No, In 10A, the payment is coming from the listing agent.
Yeah, the broker, the listing
The
agent.
broker.
Yes.
I thought you were talking about B. In
No,
B, the fee is coming directly from the seller. Now, this begs the question that Ryan brought up, and G and I were batting around yesterday. Okay, you select B, and there is no buyer's agent. You could be, I would say, and we'll discuss it further, entitled to the fee that the seller was going to pay directly to the buyer's agent. But there's a big misconception, and I think it's a harder uphill around the fact that if there is no buyer's agent, then that fee doesn't have to get paid. But it's a much tougher discussion to have with your seller than certainly if you elected
yeah, A
A.
is the easier route. But if you did do B and you're the
Yep.
listing agent, you have the 3% seller, could you then you would sign a buyer's broker agreement with the buyer, a transaction one, so you'd have two agreements signed, and then you would be protected, and then you could get that 3% directly from the seller for the buyer.
Then you have to have an uncomfortable conversation with your seller, because your seller, in their seller's mind, they elected B because in their mind, they were saying to themselves, I would imagine, no buyer's agent, I just saved a 3. Again, we're just throwing these numbers out fictitiously. I'm not supposed to be advising you on the rates of compensation. I'm opening myself up to liability, but it just makes it easier for the sake of discussion.
I don't know.
None of you guys
Is
are
there
allowed
any
to
Jim,
use
you're
this
gonna
as
have to
recommended.
you're gonna have to do an agreement between buyer, broker, and seller. So even if you become the buyer, broker, and seller's willing to pay the buyer side, you now have to negotiate that. So this becomes a little bit of a conflict of interest to me, because you're negotiating with your seller for yourself on two sides, and then you have to negotiate on behalf of the buyer to your seller. This becomes a bit of a mess.
And we can all think about those canons, right? That canons are like the general, the massive overriding rules. When everybody sat for their real estate agents exam, one of the rules was you can't put your compensation in front of the transaction. However, we just went over a scenario where I said, get the buyer's agency formed, authorizing the buyer's agent to negotiate fees from the seller ahead of time before showing the seller's agent, before showing the property to your buyer. It becomes very tough, Gia. But at the same time, we have to stay focused and move on. But yes, I agree. It definitely opens Pandora's box. What do you got, Chris?
So is it possible, Jim, to maybe offer another option, which is in the additional provisions?
Yeah, I'm going to go over that in a second. I think I know where you're going with that. If I don't cover it, let me know. And EXP and real agents have to operate the way you're going to describe, I believe.
Okay.
So then you have
EXPs came out and they said they're going to authorize that none of their agents.
I'm going to go over that in a minute. Yeah, I got a whole outline written on it because I've been working with a bunch of EXP agents on it, and and there's a different position of compass, and we'll go over that in a minute. All right, so C says no compensation will be offered to buyer's broker. That's the hard stop that we were talking about earlier. You got one of these sellers that just says, we're not paying anything under any circumstances, period, end of story. You want to make sure, where is the...
Let's go over the brokerage relationship real quick, just because that's, yeah.
All right, so the brokerage relationship, as Ryan picked out here earlier, broker will act as a transaction broker. In Florida, we don't have certain rules that they have in other states regarding dual agency. Do not ask me to dissect the difference between dual agency and transaction broker, but that's what we call it in Florida. I'm sorry if that sounds controversial. I've been doing this for a long time. I've tried to make those distinctions. I can't come up with them. It all looks like dual agency to me, but we call it in Florida transaction broker. Where is the protection provision? In the protection provision, I want you guys to strike the last sentence innocuously.
It's the other way, I think. It's down further.
Compensation, retained, brokerage relationship, conditional termination. Dispute resolution. No, there's a protection in here. I thought it was 10, but it's not. Sorry, you guys.
Jim, you passed it. It's on line 121, I think.
121.
Isn't there a protection period right there on 122?
Yep. If within, thank you, Gia, if within blank days after termination date, protection period, seller transfers or contracts to transfer the property or any interest in the property to any prospects with whom seller, broker, or any real estate licensee communicated regarding the property before the termination date. So you have that typical protection period that extends, that protects you if the listing agreement is terminated, and then the seller signs with somebody that you showed the property to during the agreement period. Unless no fee will be due broker if the property is relisted after the termination date. So what I've seen, and there's some agents on this podcast that got burned by it because they called me as soon as it happened. The buyer, the seller said, I want to take the property off the market. And we've talked about this a couple times. I don't want to beat a dead horse. I'm going to try to make it brief. They took the property off the market Monday. On Tuesday, they either signed up with their friend who's an agent, or they signed up with a flat fee agent for $100 or whatever the case may be. And now they had a new broker, and then they sold the property to a buyer that was shown the property during the listing period. Does everybody follow that?
Yeah.
And now the listing agent got cut off from their listing fee. And miraculously enough, there was no fee paid to the new listing agent, the new broker. What I would suggest you do is, in your listing agreements, striking this can be a little bit obvious and be a point of conversation. In the Compass agreement, they don't even have this provision in there, but you can always, in paragraph additional terms, paragraph 15, you can write in line 122 shall not apply to this agreement. The sentence appearing on line 22 doesn't apply, or something more innocuous. Now comes, before we jump into different brokerages and how they're handling this and why that's important to know, because you guys have to know how other brokers are handling this agreement, even though your brokerage isn't. Why? Because you're going to go to listing appointments and the person you're talking to is going to say, oh no, we just interviewed somebody else from another agency, from another brokerage, and they explained it this way. And so you're going to need to have talking points as to how you address those issues so you sound educated and why your way is better. Before we get into that, that's how we're going to wind down the show. Before we get into that, I want to talk about this. The most misunderstood paragraph in the new listing agreement that I can pick out. Paragraph 3C. Seller will pay mortgage. Are we all clear before we move on 8A and 10A and 10B and 10C? If you're using 10A, you're going to use the seller's comp form. Remember those forms that were released about a month before the new listing agreement?
Yeah. Just scroll down to it so they can see it, Jim. Just
if you're going to use, I'm going to put this in the notes so you guys have this to rely on. If you're going to use 10A, if you're going to elect the selling agent is splitting fees with the buyer's agent, that's what realtors are going to want the most because it gives them the best opportunity for the easy double dip, easy to explain double dip. You're going to use the form in the compensation packet that says seller's agent to buyer's agent. Now those forms all make sense. They released those forms ahead of time. I'm like, what the heck is this? And we tried to explain it on a podcast and I didn't do a great job. I apologize. If you elect in your listing agent, in your listing appointment with your buyer, B, then you're going to use the buyer's agency form that's buyer's agent. I mean, sellers, I'm sorry, and seller directly to buyer's agent.
Yep.
And it sounds confusing. You can have this stuff executed ahead of time. You can put it out there. You can have it as standing agreements, but you can't put it in the MLS. So these things don't have to be transaction specific. Those those additional compensation forms. You can fish those out there. All right, so now we've established what you're electing here. Now I would, in your listing appointment, go back and talk about 3C. The most misunderstood provision in the new listing agreement and the old listing agreement when I talk to agents. What number do you put there? It's a dollar value, not a percentage. I would tell you, and the Florida Association of Realtors education videos that they just released in the last 2 or 3 days say this well, but not completely perfectly. I would tell you that after you've established all those values in 8A and 10A or B or 10C, you do the math. So if they're paying a 6 on a 300, in here goes $18,000. However, in talking to agents and brokers, people are not seeing it that way. From the educational videos that I've watched, I have not seen this in writing anywhere. And if anybody does, I'd love to have it text it to me so we can publish it to everybody. But what it says here is seller will pay mortgage discount, other closing costs, or concessions not to exceed blank, and any other expenses seller agrees to pay in connection with the transaction. You could also argue that the fee that goes in there is going to be just what you're paying to the buyer side if you're going to pay a concession. In any other expenses, though, the thing that makes it hard for me to wrap my head in, any other expenses seller agrees to pay in connection with the transaction. That's a catch-all everything. That's 18%. That's whatever concession you agree to pay. Ryan, you're making the face I've seen so many times. That's whatever you agree to pay during your inspection period. If you have a pool pump that worked during the inspections and right before closing, the pool pump doesn't work. That would, in my mind, that would include anything else. But what do you know when you sign the listing agreement? You know that you're agreeing to pay seller concessions of a given amount. But it doesn't, this paragraph is entitled seller concessions. It says seller expenses.
I know.
It goes on to explain concessions, and it also goes on to explain and any other expenses seller agrees to pay in connection with a transaction. Aren't principal commissions part of that fee? Aren't commissions to the selling agent part of that fee? Isn't the pool pump that doesn't work at the closing part of that concession? So I don't have a great answer on it. I don't think you're ever going to go wrong if you put $18,000. Again, if you have a 300 sale and it's 600 commissions, if you put the 18 grand in there, if you later discover the pool pump, I don't think it's necessary to go back in and amend this thing. But I have talked to many agents that say, they're brokerages that say, we're not putting anything in there or it's not applicable. I don't believe that's correct.
Yeah, no, we have a couple questions in the chat if it can be left blank, Jim, from Wendy, and
that's not what they're educating us on in the
Mario, yes, I forgot.
Florida Association of Realtors education videos.
Jim, can we just line out that line?
I mean, yeah, it's kind of.
I don't think you're ever
I mean,
going to
it
get
really
in
is
trouble
stupid because if you think about it, how are you going to know what other expenses these sellers are going to ultimately wind up? I mean, technically, I could put in there, see attached estimated seller net sheet. If I did that on that line and wrote it in and attached this estimated seller net sheet to the listing agreement, that's the only other way I could see that you're going around this.
Well, here's what I know. If you have a transaction and the seller agrees in writing to something later in the transaction, you're not going to run afoul of this provision. In other words, you're doing a 300 paying a 6, and you in there you write 18. And right before the closing, you have a pool pump that doesn't work, that worked at the inspections. Do I think you're running afoul of the rules if you don't amend that line to include the pool pump? No, I don't think you're running afoul of the rules. But I think if you don't put a value in there, you're not representing the transaction in a manner that's consistent with the way the Florida Association of Realtors is recommending you do it.
Yes,
My
but if you
question
have the
is-
net sheet and make it part of, if you take the net sheet, the estimated net sheet with all of the fees, including professional fees, et cetera, title fees, whatever, and you make that part of the listing agreement, doesn't that cover your tush?
I think your tush is covered. My opinion, I think your tush is covered if you have a 6, if you have a 300 and they're paying a 3 and a 3, so you have a 300 sale and you put 3 in 8A and you put 3 in 10B. Somebody had their hand up forever and they just took it down. I'm very sorry. We'll get to you in a minute. I don't think you're running afoul of this provision if you put 18 in there. I also think you're going to have a lot of people who are going to put 9 in there. I also think you're going to have a lot of people that are going to do an 8A and a 10A. So the 8A says 6 and the 10A is elected and it says 3. I also think you're going to have people that put 18 in there and they're not going to have problems. What you don't want to do, I would say, is leave it blank or put not applicable or strike it out. I just think that that's not consistent. Not I just think it is not consistent with everything I've heard from Florida realtors. Wendy, what do you got?
It relates kind of to what Gio was saying, because I'm afraid if you just account for the compensation, you're not accounting for the estoppel fees, you're not accounting for the owner's title policy. And I did have an attorney that
Oof.
was listing
Yeah.
and
You
he
look at
said,
it.
what about these seller expenses? And I just said, well, this doesn't necessarily apply because I don't know what that number is going to end up being. I do know what our net sheet shows, and I'm hoping I can sell it for this amount, but I can't put a number in there. Sorry. I can't put a number in there until we know the final outcome of where everything works out.
So this is the danger of doing one of these shows. You bring up stuff that I haven't thought about, and listening to what you said, any other expenses seller agrees to pay in connection with the transaction. It does not say any other buyer expenses.
Mm-hmm.
It says expenses.
I know.
If they meant buyer expenses, it would say buyer. So now I have to lean towards Wendy and Gia, and at the risk of sounding wishy-washy, I cannot see. So here's what's nice about rules that are open to interpretation. It's very tough for a governing body to say you did it wrong. Because how many agents do we have on this podcast, Ryan?
I had 30 some, maybe 40.
I would hate to say that everybody is in consensus about how this thing should be done. Wendy, you got another thought?
Nope. I got to put my hand down.
So,
I mean, the way I'm reading this here, Jim, is like whatever number you put in there, the seller could go, "Hey, I agree not to pay over this amount."
I agree, and that's why I think,
that's
but
I
if
what it
think
they
looks
Wendy's
did pay
correct.
over that amount, it would be in writing. It's not like it's not in writing. It's more like, to me, at the time you sign the listing agreement, you put, and I would have told you before this podcast, listening to the Florida Association of Realtors talk about it, you put the gross number in there, you back into that number after you've done the lower parts of the agreement, you come back and you put the number in there that reflects the number you agreed to in 8 and section 10 and section 8.
Jim, I have a
But
question.
I have to lean towards what Wendy and G are saying.
Yeah, 'cause it says
I
other
have a
closing
question.
costs.
Is there any way, Jim, I'm going to throw this out at you, that we can add a clause to stick under the additional terms that clearly says that even though C is disclosed, that these are other closing costs and
Oh my
concessions,
gosh.
that they can fluctuate based on the terms that the seller ultimately agrees to, and we make the estimated net sheet as part of the listing
I
agreement
think
to
we can do it even
cover.
simpler, Gia. I think we can just make it a statement and I'll get back to you guys with a definitive answer on this. I think we can just put a statement in the additional terms that the value stated in 3C may be changed by things you discover during inspection, the cost of closing, the seller. You've thrown a number in there, at least that represents something that everybody can hang their hat on in 3C. So let's just say it's a 300 paying a 6. You write 18 grand in there. And then in paragraph additional terms, what is it, 15 in this agreement, I think? Then you can write something in that says the values in 3C will be affected by the cost of closing, the items, including but not limited to, the costs of closing, the items discovered during inspection that seller may agree to give additional concessions on. We'll come up with some good rules there, but this is what it takes. It takes a group of people thinking about this stuff, and then I can go back and come back with something concise that works for everyone.
Awesome, Jim.
All right. Wendy, you got your hand still up? Is that from the prior, or is that something new? All right. My suggestion is to explain that we talked about that and then come back and explain 3C after you've done the rest. All right, parting thoughts. In 10B on the listing agreement, if 10B on the listing agreement is selected, can you guys read this or should I make it bigger?
Yeah, we can read
You can
it.
see it.
All right, if 10B on the listing agreement is selected and buyer is unrepresented, so 10B is where the seller is paying the buyer directly, buyer's
Just
agent
scroll
directly.
down on that because this is the most meat of this new listing agreement. Just scroll down so people can see it as we're going through it.
All right.
10B. There you go. Yeah.
And again, this doesn't apply to EXP agents, right?
This is going to lead into the EXP agent discussion.
Okay.
But it's important that we understand the dynamic, and I hate to say you got to know what everybody's doing, but I think it's going to make your conversations easier with your seller if you understand what other agents are going to be telling your sellers. So 10B says seller authorizes broker to offer compensation. There's broker from seller. So if 10B on the listing agreement is selected and buyer is unrepresented, agent may be in a position where they are trying to convince the seller they are the agent for both sides to get the buyer side commission and double dip. This is what Ryan was talking about earlier. It's much easier to do this if your broker allows you to elect 10A.
Yeah.
The Compass listing agreements I've seen only allow 10A. So here's what the difference is between the listing agreements that I've seen. So the proprietary Compass agreement only allows you to elect 10A. Compass corporate so far is not allowing sellers to pay compensation to buyers agents directly. In contrast, EXP and real agents I've seen only allow 10B elections. That is, they only allow the seller to pay buyers concessions. They only allow the seller to pay buyers concessions. My thoughts on how these agents can get paid on both sides when there is no buyer's agent. In paragraph 8A, put a big splittable number. I would suggest, just for the sake of this discussion, it's a 6. And then you elect 10B as your broker, as the brokers I've seen in those two brokers right now allow. And then in the additional terms, you write broker's compensation shall be reduced by the amount seller pays buyer's broker. However, the compensation due broker may not be less than 3%. That's how I would say you get the double dip. If you work for one of those agencies. And before you use this, get your buyer's broker's authorization. I'll make this stuff available for you guys. The Florida Realtors has a new video they just released in August of 2024. It's pretty good. It's confusing. It's long. It goes into depth about the discussion on the IDX feed, Ryan. And it goes into this new buyer's agency agreement. It came out. This one is done by the Florida Association of Realtors attorney. This one is done by a woman named Patty Ketchum. She's not an attorney from what I understand, but she also runs a brokerage and she also works with the Florida Association of Realtors, is my understanding. She does a good job of doing some practical explanations. And there is a good discussion in there about buyer's agency tactics, very similar to the one I described to you when the seller refuses to pay compensation. And then I have something at the end about how to shift control and not shift title fees. If you guys are working and you want to make us the title agent or your preferred title agent the title agent, leave the standard elections in the contract the way you want to see the parties' title fees paid. In other words, if you're in Palm Beach County, you select seller pays for title, and then in paragraph 20 on line 590, you write the closing agent is New Path Title, or whoever your title agent is that you want to use capital C, capital A, that's a defined term. There is a difference between the escrow agent and the closing agent. Escrow agent holds the funds, closing agent does the closing. Sometimes they're the same. Many agents don't know the difference. If you write in here, paragraph 20, the closing agent is New Path Title or your favorite title agency, now you're going to have, if you're a buyer's agent, the seller is still going to pay for title and the buyer is going to control where the title goes. Many times the sellers will just give in and they just want to get the deal done. Some agents give pushback. You don't want to lose a deal, but if you want to control more of the deal, that's a tactic I've seen lots of agents use recently to control the title. Chris, what do you got?
So going to paragraph 10, I guess in speaking to a number of different brokers, if 10C is elected, my interpretation of what other people are saying is that they're telling the buyer's broker to put it in the deal. That the seller's not setting forth a number, and they're just telling the buyer's broker in communication, however that may be, put it in the deal.
Put it in there regardless. Yep.
Okay. All right. So, but 10B, the number is being set by the seller.
Yep.
And we know what that is.
Yep.
So in all three of them, compensation can still be due. It is just how it enters the deal.
Yep.
Okay.
And it can also be changed. So if it can also change along the way, and there's modification agreement forms in the packet that Florida Association of Realtors has issued. They have not issued the disclosure form yet, but if you just use that one sentence, brokers' commissions are not set by law and are fully negotiable, then you should be in the clear. But they've given modification forms for all these agreements now that you can use Agile along the way as commissions change. You can always charge less. You can always receive less, but as soon as you want to get more, you got to amend your agreement. Angela?
Hi, Jim.
Hey.
I wanted to ask, if seller decides they are going to give commission to both sides, is there a preference that you suggest we elect seller to buyer's agent or listing agent to buyer's broker? I was wondering if you think
10A.
one over the other.
10A.
Okay.
10A is your realtor's go-to.
Yeah.
10B is going to be a seller's go-to because they think they may get out of paying half. However, I would tell you that if there is no buyer's agent, we were talking about it a second ago, that there is an opportunity for you to convince your seller that you're the buyer's agent, especially if somebody mentioned it earlier, you get a buyer's agency agreement signed. Now you're due both sides, even if they select 10B. Does that make sense, you guys? Anybody says no, don't, this is a safe zone. Nobody's
That's my understanding. Like if you did elect B, right, you'd have to get a buyer's agency if you have a direct buyer with the buyer. Buyer's agency agreement with the buyer. I mean, theoretically, you could say the seller's offering to the buyer broker 2%, and you get a buyer's broker agreement with the buyer at 3%, and seller would pay 2% and they pay 1%.
But you have to put yourself in the seller's mind, right?
Yeah.
The seller is thinking, if they've talked to anybody, because there's plenty of chat rooms and there's plenty of writing on this, and I've seen it, you know, I hate to
Well,
say
over
100 times
CNN. I mean,
over.
CNN front page yesterday.
Well, yeah, but what they're saying specifically with Florida, Ryan, is if the seller elects 10B, they can only be paying half the commission. If the seller elects 10A and there's no buyer's agent, they're always going to pay the full. That's not necessarily true, because I can see a seller paying a full 6 even if they elect 10B. So just be aware that if your seller is receiving that messaging, that's going to be a talking point that you need to have in your bag of tricks as you walk in a listing appointment. Same thing with if you walk into a listing appointment, you're not EXP, you're not Real, you're not Compass, and the seller says, well, my last agent said of this, you're going to know right away, well, that's how Compass does business, and here's why we do business this other way. We find the pool of buyers is bigger when you offer buyer's comp, and here's how we offer it, or whatever your script is going to be. Monica Otero had her hand up for a long time earlier. Monica, I'm very sorry. Did you have something you wanted to add that we haven't addressed?
No, you already addressed it. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Yeah.
We're at
Al-
11:11. I promised I was going to get you out of here in an hour.
No, but Alice, this is a huge topic, Jim. But
Yeah.
what about writing additional terms that should I have the buyer as well, then only XX due at closing? So let's say you offered select A, right? Seller authorized broker to offer compensation, but then you're saying if I get a direct buyer, then I'll do the whole deal at 4% or 5% instead
Could
of
you
6%.
ratchet down your gross if you represent both sides in that paragraph, additional terms? Yeah.
Of course. Yeah.
You just have to be, you can't offer ranges, you have to be specific, and you have to give, you can say an amount not to exceed, but you can't put a range of fees. Like it has to be, the seller has to know, or whoever you're dealing with, if you're on the buy side, your buyer's agent, they have to know what's the maximum they're gonna pay. You can always accept less. And the guys in our office, Tajay and Christian and I have batted this around. We can see some agents putting a splittable number here, like a 6, and some agents selecting 10B, and some sellers going to closing. If there's a 6 at the top and a 3 at the bottom,
9%.
and the selling agents out there with their hand out for the 9% and a huge source of friction and hurdle at the closing table when they see their $300,000 sale paying $27,000 in commissions.
Yep. Hey,
Don't think it's not going to happen.
I know people are going to make mistakes on these and this is funny because I now hear that listing agents want to see the buyer's agency agreements from the buyer's agent before they show the property. And then if I'm the buyer's agent, I'm like, well, I want to see the listing agreement. I want to see the listing or see if you're offering, what you're offering. It's going to be interesting.
So,
I've
heard in the Florida Association of Realtor discussions that don't feel like you got to present that stuff. Again, I haven't seen this in writing any place, but that we're going to keep doing this over and over and over as the rules get codified. Codified is when they get reduced to writing, and we'll have websites and links to all the relevant stuff. But don't think for a second that this stuff that we're talking about, these obscure things, aren't going to come up. It's absolutely going to come up in stuff we haven't even considered. And we have to go by the best information we have available to us today, which sometimes are these videos released by the Florida Association of Realtors. You cannot go by videos given by brokerages trying to attract agents. I have heard videos from brokers in North Florida. They're on YouTube, they're not down, and they are giving complete misstatements of the rules.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Hey, Sophia's been really patient here. She has a question, Jim. I have a client that wants the buyer, so I guess you're the listing agent, Sophia, to pay closing costs. How do I write that in? What would that include? The buyer pays title. So,
again, the big rule is you cannot stipulate in writing the seller's concession to buyer is for broker fees. All you can say in writing is that the seller is paying a concession. So in your offer, you would say that the seller is paying a 3% concession, a 2% concession, a 1% concession. Now you have to, as a buying agent, you have to have the conversation with your buyer as to how that concession is going to be applied. And I would say when you're doing your buyer's agency appointment and you're talking to your buyer and you're getting your agency agreement signed, you want to use little trigger words in those discussions. And the trigger word you're going to say to your buyer is going to be concession, concession, concession. When you see the word concession, that's how I get paid.
Yeah.
So when you're talking to your buyer at the onset of your listing appointment, you're going to say some sellers are going to offer concessions to buyers and some sellers aren't.
Yeah.
Concession.
Wendy's got a great point here too. Like, let's do that, Jim. She goes, are title companies now going to ask for these listing agreements and buyer brokers agreements? I mean, is that something that
Great question. So here's what we've gleaned so far from these rules. We're going to get DAs from the brokers, from the agents, distribution authorities. The distribution authorities are going to have to match. Otherwise, we're going to go back and say, hey, buyer's broker, hey, seller's broker, you guys have conflicting DAs, come to a consensus and send us something in writing. We cannot interpret. I talked to an agent the other day, and you can't even make this stuff up. The agent thought that the title company was like the arbiter of the transaction. And the agent was telling me I'm wrong and that the default was clear and you got to pay the money to the seller because the buyer's default was so clear. You guys, a title agent, their job, they're a neutral intermediary. I find I make more money myself personally if I help you guys get to the closing table than if I sell lawyer hours. So I've made the professional decision to help you guys get the closings. But the reality is a title company doesn't have to pass opinions or give help on anything. They're supposed to just collect documents, collect money, and make disbursements. We've made a business decision that we're going to help agents get the closings faster and more efficiently. But that's not the role of a title agent. That's a personal decision I've made. Title agent can only disperse escrow under two fact patterns. One, the parties agree. Two, a judge orders. So no matter how obvious the default is, a title agent can't disperse escrow money to the seller because the buyer defaults until the parties agree or a judge orders. Period. End of story. Now, we've had crazy corner cases, and I don't want to go down a rabbit hole, where you got a seller that disappears and they go, it was a stolen listing and blah, blah, blah. And the buyer, they never signed the contract and the money's already sitting in escrow. Yeah, we've made the decision to give the money back to the buyer without a judge's order. We had one where a seller signed the contract and I think we gave the money back to the buyer. I took the risk. But just understand, the title company, there's another important point here too that keeps coming up recently is, if you cancel during the inspection period, this has nothing to do with buyer's agency or seller's agency. If the buyer cancels during the inspection period, the seller does not have to give the money back carte blanche automatically right away. Does everybody understand why that is? Because there's an inspection, there's a degradation, there's a damages provision in the inspection clause that says that the seller can use the escrow to restore the property. And I had a transaction where the buyer actually destroyed the property during the inspections unknowingly. The escrow was $300,000 and they thought they'd just cancel and move on to another deal. Don't be that agent that tells your buyer just cancel during inspections and you get your money back right away. Sometimes it doesn't happen with legal reasons, with legal justification.
Mm-hmm.
All right, I don't want to ride that horse too long.
Ilana has a quick question here. An out-of-town agent contacted me about my listing. She plans to send her client along with a designer to view the property. Are there any specific documents that need to be signed by the client or the buyer's agent aside from the buyer's broker agreement?
So the buyer is sending, I'm sorry, I'm probably just numb at this point.
It's an out-of-state agent sending a buyer to directly to to Ilana for her listing. I mean, I would assume, you know, that you'd want to have some
An out-of-state agent or an out-of-state buyer with an in-state
an
agent?
an out-of-town agent. So, I mean, maybe she wants a referral agreement, you know?
No, hi guys. Thank you so
Hey,
much. So
I'm sorry.
valuable. I so appreciate your time. Yes, no, the agent is local. She is on vacation. She wants to send me a client on the property that I represent the seller in. I'm not really sure. She reached out to me this morning. She said not really sure what to do with some documents that we need to sign in order for me to send my client to view the property.
So you're the listing agent
Yes,
and you've got a buyer's agent that's not available right now. And the buyer's agent wants to send the buyer in there directly and
correct.
deal with you.
Yes.
Yeah, so you're marketing, they call it in the NAR FAQs, they call it marketing. You're marketing for the seller. You can talk to the buyer all you want. The buyer has an agent, they've identified their agent. You don't need to see the agency agreement. That's something that I've heard brokers misstate in podcasts. There's no rule that I've seen, and I've heard from Florida Realtors attorney that requires you disclose those agreements. And among other things, it could be a violation of your duty to your seller if you hang your hat on, well, I can't let you see the property until you show me your buyer's agreement. That could be a violation of your duty to the seller.
I understand. Okay, so she would have to have the buyer's broker agreement signed with her client for her end.
That buyer would have to sign a buyer's brokerage agreement with their buyer. So the rule, it doesn't bind buyers, the rule binds agents. Buyers can look at any properties they want without agents. Buyers don't have to sign buyer's agreements, but as soon as agents want to get paid in a transaction, they have to have a signed buyer's agency agreement, which brings up another important rule is make sure when you're talking to your buyers, there will be testers testing on this. Make sure when you're talking to your buyers that you don't say you have to sign a buyer's brokerage agreement to look at properties. The correct statement is you have to sign a buyer's brokerage agreement before I can show you or any other realtor can show you properties.
Got it. That's important. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a biggie I probably should have gone into earlier in the convo before we started losing people.
And really quickly, I have clients, not clients, I have other agents reaching out to me and asking if my seller is willing to compensate. What do I say in that scenario?
Send me an offer.
Send me an offer, and I would not discuss how much it is or what it is.
You can discuss what it is if they're offering it, but if your seller elects 10C, right?
Oh,
They've given you, if you're, go ahead, I'm sorry.
no, I'm still operating on the listing that was signed about 2 months ago. So
Yep, so if your seller has elected 10C or said they're not paying buyer's comp, and you get a buyer's agent that says, I'm not making an offer and you know, my buyer, so let's just say you have a buyer and the buyer tells you, don't make any offers on properties that aren't offering buyer's comp. We're gonna expand on the fact pattern a little bit. I would tell you, you still wanna bring properties to your buyer's attention that aren't paying buyer's comp, but you lead with the discussion with the seller's agent by saying, my buyer only wants to see properties paying buyer's comp. Or is there any way you can pay buyer's comp? If you're on the sales side, you say, send me the offer. My seller said they're not paying buyer's comp. But you never know what happened the night before that might affect your seller. You never know. And I've had this when I was selling property personally. My wife and I will say, we're only going to sell under these terms. Then we get an offer and we do something different. So you don't want to say, don't send the offer to the buyer's agent who calls the seller's agent and says, we're only, I'm only going to make offers that include buyer's comp. Is your seller offering? And your seller says, they're not offering. Your statement would be, they're not offering, but send the offer over.
got it. Thank you, Jim.
You're very welcome. Anybody else have any questions? You guys, here's something that's scary. I see kids of realtors that I've been working with now on our podcast, on our discussion forum. I've been doing this so long. I'm seeing children of the agents I schooled years and years and years ago now showing up in our discussions. That's scary. I still enjoy it as much as I ever did, and that's a blessing, but that's scary that I've been doing this long. Anyways, does anybody else have any questions?
Chris had one. He says, do you have language we should be using if we are requesting the seller to pay the buyer's broker fee?
Apart from what's in the listing agreement?
Yeah, I guess Chris, is that you
So I
want?
think what Chris is describing, go ahead, Chris.
So Jim, I guess just to clarify, I call another agent and I say, hey, I just showed your listing at 123 Main Street. What are you guys offering for compensation? And the listing agent says, Chris, just put it in the deal, right?
Yeah.
So I'm going to put my compensation into the transaction. I'm going to assume under additional provisions,
Yeah.
I'm putting language about what I'm requesting for my compensation. And then I'm going to move to that addendum that says seller is paying buyer's broker X amount when we get to that.
Compensation. Yeah, the
That's
compensation.
exactly what I was going to say.
Yeah.
You totally headed it off at the pass. You're going to send over your offer in paragraph 20. It's going to say the statement about compensation, concessions, seller's going to pay to buyer, paragraph 20. And then as soon as you get that thing signed, you want to shore it up by sending the form, the form that the flavor.
Seller to buyer's broker.
Seller to buyer's broker or seller's agent to buyer's agent. Whichever one it is, whoever's paying. But you're going to start by saying seller's concession to buyer, 2%, 3%, or the.
So I'm sorry to kind of belabor it. So it can't just be as simple as seller agrees to pay the buyer's broker compensation of blank. It just can't be that simple.
Yeah, it can.
Okay.
Then you want to use capital S because that's going to mean that seller, and there's be no confusion between seller or seller's agent. And if it's going to be the seller's agent, you want to use seller's agent. You know, so you want to specify where it's coming from. And I've seen other people say in the offer, Chris, I've seen other agents say, and I don't think it's wrong, seller's side is paying buyer's concessions X. And then you follow up with the conversation. Is it coming from the seller's agent or is it coming from the seller? And then you use the appropriate form. There's other agents that are leading with the compensation form and the contract simultaneously.
Yep.
Which I don't think is a bad practice. And there are agents, I'm saying this slowly so it resonates with everybody and marinates and sinks in. There are agents that are posting the compensation forms on their websites, not the MLS website, not the MLS site. So when you go to the site, you're seeing right off the bat, seller is paying X and here's the form. The only time you can't use those forms, and I've heard this repeatedly, is between brokerages as a standing agreement between brokerages. It has to be property specific. Are you guys numb?
Yeah, I mean, it's important stuff, Jim. I mean, thank you for bringing some clarity on this. You know, I mean, this is what we cover on these biweekly webinars. You know, one of Jim's favorite sayings, iron sharpens iron. And this is the discussion, right? And we're like crowdsourcing knowledge to help each other and make this whole process, especially this big process of these new agreements, a lot easier. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Jim, for doing this. If you haven't checked out Jim's...
I want to, before we jump into the extra, I want to mention one thing, you guys, what we mentioned at the beginning. This thing, we've seen the transition from paper to the web. We've seen the transition from inspections in the contract to not inspections. We've seen the recession. We've seen Chinese drywall. Everybody thought this was the death nail to real estate agents. It didn't. We quickly moved through it. We quickly adapted. This will go the same way. All right. Sorry, Ryan. I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, thanks, guys. Thanks, everybody, for attending. We're going to keep bringing you value bi-weekly, help share knowledge and make us all better. And if you haven't yet, check out Jim's awesome title company, New Path Title. I mean, they have some amazing software called Title Leap. It's like a free contract coordinator to help you on your closings. I hate doing deals with title companies now that don't have that software. Also, Title Advance. You can get free title reports from Jim. So there's no surprises. You go into closing and, oh my gosh, there's some kind of crazy lien that needs to be, that's going to hold up closing, which is awesome. So check them out. And of course, I want you to check out RealTrade. You can just Google RealTrade. It's an online marketplace and social media platform for real estate. We got thousands of buyers and sellers that can connect with you. Well, of course, you can connect with other agents and other service providers here, be more efficient in your real estate transactions. So check those two out.
Thanks, guys.
The Title Advance site is down right now. We're doing some work on it. If anybody wants a Title Advance, just text me the address. You can find my email, my phone number on newpathtitle.com. I'm easy to get a hold of. You can just click on 24/7 attorney support. You can text me the address. We'll get you the Title Advance quick. And that's it. Thanks, Ryan. Oh, and don't forget, Ryan, you failed to mention RealTrade, home of the double dip. You guys, I've heard from many buyers, agents, and sellers agents, or sellers agents in particular, that RealTrade is the spot that won them the double dip. You're going to see more and more buyers using tools like this. It's just what they're going to do. And RealTrade is a great platform for agents taking advantage of that opportunity.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. Have a great week. Good luck out there.